Son called on a Tuesday. That was the first thing wrong. We talk on Sundays. That's been our routine since he moved to Portland 6 years ago. Sunday evenings, after he puts the kids to bed, he calls me and we talk for 20-30 minutes about nothing in particular. The weather. His commute. Whether I've been eating enough since his mother passed. It's a small ritual, but it's ours. And in 61 years of living, I've learned that small rituals are the things that actually hold a life together. So when my phone rang on a Tuesday and his name came up on the screen, I felt something shift. Not panic. Just a small, quiet wrongness. Like when you reach for your coffee mug and it's not where you left it. I picked up. He said, "Hey, Dad, you doing okay?" His voice was normal, cheerful even. I told him I was fine, asked what was up, mentioned I was in the middle of grilling some chicken. He laughed and said he just wanted to check in, that he'd been thinking about me. We talked for a while, about the grandkids, about his wife's new job, about whether I'd looked into getting the gutters cleaned before fall. Normal stuff, easy conversation. And then, right before he said goodbye, he paused. He said, "Hey, Dad, remember that song you used to whistle when I was a kid? The one from that old Western?" I did remember. It was from a movie I loved when I was young. A slow, wandering melody. I used to whistle it around the house without even thinking about it, the way some people hum without knowing they're humming. My son must have heard me do it 10,000 times growing up. I said, "Yeah, of course. Why?" He said, "You whistled it during the last couple minutes of our call." I hadn't even noticed. He said, "I just wanted to make sure you were okay." I told him I was fine. We said goodbye. I went back to my chicken. But I kept thinking about what he said. That I'd been whistling without realizing it. I do that sometimes when I'm anxious. I've done it since I was a kid myself, but I hadn't thought I was anxious about anything. I turned the idea over a few times and then let it go. Or tried to. Here's the part I have to tell you, even though it embarrasses me. I'm 61 years old. I spent 30 years as a high school history teacher. I've read enough about human nature to think I understand it reasonably well. I know about manipulation. I know about con artists. I've taught lessons about them, and when it was happening to me, I didn't see it at all. His name was Paul. He'd moved into the house at the end of my street about 4 months earlier. A widower, he told me. Retired from the railroad. He had a soft voice and an easy laugh, and he always seemed to be outside doing something useful. Raking leaves, adjusting his mailbox, carrying bags in from his car. We started nodding to each other, then talking. Then one afternoon, he walked over while I was trying to figure out why my riding mower wouldn't start, and within 10 minutes, he had it running. I liked him. That's the honest truth. He reminded me a little of my wife's father. A practical, quiet man who showed up and helped without making a production of it. He had that same quality of not needing anything from you except company. We started having coffee on Thursday mornings. He'd come over around 9, I'd make a pot, and we'd sit at the kitchen table for an hour. He asked good questions. He remembered things I told him. He asked about my son, about the grandkids, about what I taught. He seemed genuinely interested in a way that a lot of people aren't, not even people who think of themselves as good listeners. It was around week 6 or 7 that he mentioned the investment. He brought it up casually, the way you mention something you've been meaning to say but kept forgetting. A friend of his, he said, ran a small private fund. Nothing complicated, nothing flashy, conservative, stable, the kind of thing regular people didn't usually get access to because the minimums were too high, but Paul's friend occasionally made exceptions for people he trusted. I said that sounded interesting, because it did. I'm not a wealthy man, but I'd been careful over the years. I had my pension, some savings, a modest IRA. Since my wife got sick and then after she died, I'd been thinking more about whether what I had would hold. I wasn't desperate, but I was paying attention. I told him I'd think about it. He nodded and said there was no rush. We changed the subject and talked about something else. That was it. But he mentioned it again the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. Always briefly, always just as a passing thought. Not pushy, just present. He brought some paperwork once. Said his friend had put together some information in case I was curious. It looked professional. I didn't know what I was looking at, really. I'd never been sophisticated about finance. But it looked like what I imagined that kind of document should look like. I told him I'd take a closer look. What I didn't do was look anything up. I didn't search the company name. I didn't ask my son. I didn't call my bank or a financial advisor. I'd thought about all of those things, but each time I'd told myself I was just in the research phase, just gathering information, and there was no need to make calls and involve people until I knew whether this was something I was actually going to pursue. That's the lie I told myself. The truth is that I didn't look into it because some part of me didn't want to. Didn't want to find something that would make me feel foolish for liking Paul. Didn't want to lose the Thursday coffees. My wife would have made me look. She had a practical intelligence I never fully developed. She would have sat down at the laptop that same night and started searching, and she would have found something, and she would have told me plainly what she found. But she wasn't there, and I had gotten used to making decisions in a quieter house, which meant I had gotten used to not being challenged. One Thursday, he mentioned that his friend was closing the fund to new participants at the end of the month, that if I was interested, I'd need to decide soon. I said I'd have an answer by next week. That night, I called my son on a Sunday like normal, and I talked about the weather, about the grandkids, about the gutters. I didn't mention Paul. I told myself I'd bring it up once I'd made a decision, because I didn't want to seem like I couldn't handle my own affairs. I was 61, not 6. And sometime during that call, without knowing I was doing it, I whistled. The following Tuesday, he called back. He said it gently. He didn't lead with accusations or alarm. He just asked if there was anything going on, anything I wanted to talk through. I told him everything was fine. He said, "Okay, I believe you. Can I just ask, is there anything big you're thinking about deciding lately, financially or otherwise?" I felt my chest tighten in a way I recognized. Not because I was afraid of my son, because I knew that tightening. I'd felt it before, years ago. Every time I was about to admit something I should have said earlier. I told him about Paul. I told him about the coffees and the investment and the paperwork and the deadline at the end of the month. I tried to tell it straight, the way I used to ask my students to present facts before they offered interpretations. I didn't editorialize. I just described what had happened. There was a silence on the other end. Then he said, "Dad, I need you to not commit to anything until we talk more. Can you do that?" I said I could. He asked me to send him a photo of the paperwork. I did. He called back in less than an hour. He said the company on the documents didn't appear to be registered with the SEC. He'd searched the name of the so-called fund manager and found variations of the same name connected to complaints filed in 2 other states. He'd found a pattern, not dramatic, not headlines, just a slow accumulation of older men, living alone, being befriended by someone who seemed trustworthy, and then being offered an opportunity that didn't quite exist. I sat in my kitchen and listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. When he finished, I said, "How much do you think he was going to take?" He said, "Probably whatever you were willing to give him." The part that stayed with me longest wasn't the money. I hadn't given him any yet. I'd been close. I'd been thinking about $50,000, which was more than I want to admit. But I hadn't signed anything, hadn't transferred anything. That part was luck, and I knew it. What stayed with me was the structure of it, the patience. Paul hadn't rushed me. He'd given me 4 months of Thursday mornings, 4 months of genuine feeling conversation, 4 months of showing up and being useful and asking good questions. He'd built something that felt like friendship and then waited for the right moment to use it. That kind of patience is its own form of cruelty. My son came down the following weekend. He drove 8 hours. He didn't make a thing of it. He said he'd been meaning to visit, that the kids had been asking about Grandpa. We had dinner. We watched something on TV, and at some point we talked about what I was going to do. I'd already decided I wasn't going to confront Paul. My son agreed that was the right call. Instead, we contacted the county sheriff's non-emergency line and filed a report. We were told there wasn't much they could do without a transaction having occurred, but they took the information and said they'd look into prior complaints. A few weeks later, someone called to tell me there had been 2 other reports from people in a nearby county, an older woman who had lost $22,000 and a man who had lost more than that. I don't know what happened to Paul after that. He was gone from the house at the end of my street within a month of my son's visit. Moved out quietly the way he'd moved in. I don't know if there were charges. I don't know if he's doing the same thing to someone else right now. I think about that last part more than I probably should. My son and I still talk on Sundays. That hasn't changed. But something else changed. Something I didn't expect. About 2 months after all of this happened, he called me on a random Wednesday evening. No particular reason. He just said he'd been driving home and thought of me. We talked for 40 minutes about nothing. Before he hung up, he said, "Dad, if you ever whistle again, I'm going to drive straight down." I laughed. It was the first real laugh I'd had in a while. But here's the thing I've thought about since, the thing I want to say clearly, because I don't think it gets said enough. Paul never felt like a stranger to me. That's the point. That's the whole mechanism. I was guarded around strangers. I would have been suspicious of someone I didn't know coming up to me and suggesting an investment. My guard was up for strangers, so Paul didn't become a stranger. He became a neighbor first, then a coffee companion, then something close enough to a friend that my defenses rearranged themselves around him rather than including him. The threat doesn't always come from outside the circle. Sometimes someone takes their time and builds their way in. I have a different relationship with my Thursday mornings now. I still drink coffee. I sit at the same table. I look out at the same yard. But I've started calling my son more. Not just Sundays. And I've started being more honest about what's on my mind before it becomes something I'm carrying alone. That's the real thing his phone call did. Not just the money it saved me, though I'm grateful for that. It reminded me that I don't have to hold things until I've made a decision about them. That the people who love you would rather hear the incomplete thought than find out later you carried it alone. We made the whistling thing official after. He brought it up on a Sunday call a few weeks later, said we should make it intentional, said if I was ever whistling without meaning to, I was probably processing something and he wanted to know. I told him that sounded like something his mother would have suggested. He said, "I know. That's why I'm suggesting it. We don't need to talk every day. We don't need to check in constantly or turn every phone call into a wellness assessment. We just needed one thread, one small signal that didn't require me to say I need help, because sometimes that's the hardest sentence in the English language for a man who spent 60 years thinking he's supposed to have things handled. It doesn't have to be a whistle. It doesn't have to be a code or a song or anything formal. It just needs to be something only the two of you know, something small enough to slip into an ordinary conversation. Something that says, I'm here and I'm paying attention, without either of you having to make it a moment. My son learned that from me, actually. When he was 9 years old, he went through a hard stretch, got picked on at school, didn't want to talk about it. I told him we'd have a signal. If he ever needed me to come get him from somewhere without making a scene, or if he needed to end a phone call but couldn't say so directly, he'd say "sounds good" twice in a row. Just those 2 words, back to back, and I'd know. He used it once at a birthday party when he was 11, called me to say he wasn't feeling well, said sounds good at the end, and I was there in 15 minutes. I forgot about it for years. He didn't. That's the thing about the people who love you. They hold on to the things you taught them long after you stopped remembering you taught them at all. And sometimes, 30 years later, when you're sitting in a kitchen you've lived in too long and a little too quietly, they send it back to you. I've thought about what happened with Paul more times than I can count, and every time I circle back to the same uncomfortable truth, the whole thing worked because I let it work, not out of stupidity. Out of something quieter and harder to name, a willingness to feel less alone that I hadn't admitted to myself yet. That's the cause. The effect was almost $50,000 gone. Almost. What stopped it wasn't a system or a safeguard. It was a whistle I didn't know I was making, and a son who remembered something I taught him 30 years ago and quietly kept watching for it. There's a kind of integrity in that, in paying attention to someone even when they're telling you everything is fine. My son had the character to not take my word for it, to call anyway, to ask the quiet question instead of the direct one, because he knew me well enough to know I'd shut down if he came in with accusations. That's not just love. That's wisdom about how love actually has to work sometimes. I didn't have that clarity when it was happening. I knew something felt slightly off. Not about Paul, but about myself. I was making excuses I didn't examine. I was avoiding the simple search that would have taken 4 minutes. I told myself it was because I wasn't ready to decide yet, but the honest version is that I didn't want my gut checked. And that gap between what I sensed and what I was willing to look at is exactly the space Paul was counting on. Con artists don't beat your intelligence. They beat your reluctance to use it. I'm a man who spent 30 years teaching critical thinking to teenagers, and I still fell for it because critical thinking requires a willingness to apply it to things you'd rather not question. That's the harder part. Anyone can analyze something they don't care about. The real test is whether you'll turn that same scrutiny on a situation where being wrong means losing something comfortable. I lost the Thursday coffees. I lost whatever I'd started to feel sitting across that kitchen table from someone who seemed to like me and had no obvious reason to pretend. That wasn't nothing. Loneliness after loss is real, and Paul read it accurately and used it deliberately. I don't excuse him for that. But I also don't pretend that the loneliness wasn't there, or that it wasn't doing some of the work for him. What I have now is better, even if it's smaller. My son calls on Tuesdays sometimes. We have a signal that doesn't need to be explained. I've stopped treating self-sufficiency like a virtue that covers all situations, because it doesn't. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay in contact with the people who are allowed to notice when something's off. The whistle started as a nervous habit I never chose. It became a thread between my son and me that held when I didn't know I needed holding. I didn't build that thread deliberately, but I stayed honest enough, for long enough, in enough small moments over enough years, that when it mattered, the thread was there. That's the only part of this I want to hold on to. Not the close call, not the embarrassment, but the fact that something I gave my son when he was 9 years old came back to me when I was 61 and needed it. What you put into the people you love doesn't disappear. It waits.